Hi. We return to the Jacob cycle today as we enter into Genesis 27. Although, as you can see on the right side of the screen, the chapter that we just completed, chapter 26, features features Isaac and Rebekah here in chapter 26, is tightly integrated into the larger chiasm of the Jacob story. So it'll be parallels, we'll see, to the other so-called interlude in chapter 34 when they end up in Shechem in the rape of Dinah. And so here we're moving into this section, and technically we're going to start with 26:34 and go through 28:9, and this is tightly parallel to what we're going to see down here. At one level, the story that we're going to look at is familiar. It's the story of Jacob and his mother Rebekah tricking Isaac over the blessing just after he had bought the birthright from his brother Esau directly in chapter 25. And it seems on the surface reading of the story that that's exactly what's happening, that Rebekah conspires with Jacob to try to get Jacob to convince Isaac that he's Esau, and old feeble Isaac falls for it and Jacob gets the blessing, and when Esau comes back in, he's upset and Isaac's upset and the whole thing falls apart. But that's only one way to read it. And as we're going to see by using the techniques I've been using throughout this series and throughout my Radical Bible series of looking very closely at the text, of paying close attention to the cultural context in which we can best discern the text was written, and paying attention to parallels both intratextually, which is say inside Genesis, and also intertextually between Genesis and other texts, we can begin to get more of a clear understanding of what's going on. So we're going to be doing this introduction just to clear the air of what might be some presuppositions, many of which scholars seem to carry without examining them, and we're going to at least question those, so as we go through the story we can see if those assumptions are worthy of being assumptions or whether they should all be challenged. As we continue to look at the Jacob story itself, has this basic shape, roughly chiastic, with the three opening sections here of Jacob and Esau, and of course that's where we are here, and we'll see Jacob and Esau in the end. So this is setting us up for Jacob going to the old country and being with Laban for several chapters, which is to say 20 years, and then coming back out to be reunited with Esau at the end. An interesting aspect of our story, and I've got to show this in relatively small print, in fact make it really small print so you can see the whole big thing, is the large chiasm. And if you can just see from the color coordinator where the gray and the gray match and then the blue and the blue match, etc., and then we can zoom in here a little more closely, we can see what's going on. This chiasm is from Craig Smith. It moderates one that I have from Fishbane, whose chiasm, larger chiasm we have here. And it's a very good one in the sense that it clearly shows parallels in terms of who's speaking. And we'll look more closely at the structure of the story later around that. But I want to highlight that what we're doing is not just looking at chapter 27, we're framing it around the question of Esau gaining women, both at the beginning and at the end. And I think that's the key to the entire story. And scholars who miss that that's part of the story miss the whole point. Another aspect, so intratextually, as I was noting, is how this story echoes things that we've seen from earlier. So there are a number of parallels from Genesis 12, the call of Abram that we saw back there, including these. It's structured around an underlying implicit event, the law that punishment would follow the abduction of a man's wife in Genesis 12, and the law of primogeniture here. In both, there's a falsification of identity, saying that Sarah was her sister, and of course saying that Jacob is Esau, and a question posed by the antagonist, Pharaoh and Isaac, in the story in Egypt, which expresses disillusionment there. There are also interesting and fascinating parallels with Genesis 22, including the fact that the father and son are alone. One party, in case Abraham, or in the case of Isaac perhaps, reveals less than the full truth. The two phrases, my son and here I am, in the same verse are only in 22:7 and twice in our chapter here, so highlighting the parallel between Jacob's relationship with Isaac and Isaac's relationship with Abraham. The Hebrew for went and took, regarding the ram and the kid, as the means that alters the seemingly inevitable here in both cases. So the ram in chapter 22 and the kid that Rebekah gives Jacob instead of the wild game that Esau gets. And we also see parallels with chapter 25, of course, but including the wordplay, which I didn't put here, between birthright, Bekorah, and blessing, Barakah, just reversing the middle consonants. In both of them, Esau is coming in from the field. In both of them, there's a request for a meal from the one duped, which is Esau or Isaac, depending upon who we think is being duped. And the words for eating and drinking are together in those places and only two other places in the same verse in Genesis. So we're expected to read this story both in light of the earlier incident between Jacob and Esau, but also between Abraham and Isaac and Abraham and Sarah and Pharaoh back here. There's also another way to be reading it, and that's in light of the monarchy story. And there are a number of places that I've been highlighting along the way where Genesis is parallel to the monarchy story. And we'll see more when they get to the old country in Paddan Aram with Laban. We'll see how it's parallel with the monarchy in a different way. This is not from me, this is from a number of other scholars, but according to this reading, Isaac is parallel with David, the father passing on the blessing or the reign. Esau is parallel with Adonijah, the elder son who reaches out to claim the prize but doesn't get it. Rebekah is parallel with Bathsheba, the mother of the other son who seeks to manipulate the father to choose her son, whether that's Jacob or Solomon. And then Jacob equals Solomon, the other son who ends up with the prize. So if that's assuming that the Solomon story is first and the Genesis story is a commentary on it, I'd like to suggest that one of the themes in Genesis throughout is anti-monarchy. And we've seen some of that already all the way back to the very beginning, and we're going to see that more as we go through this cycle. There are also some interesting parallels in the plot between our current story and the First King's story. And both Isaac and David are old, and there's an implicit question of their mental acuity, although I'm going to challenge that in terms of Isaac, although many scholars assume that Isaac is mentally and physically challenged. All we know is that he's blind, or close to blind. There's an uncertainty in readers over whether the father, that is Isaac or David, are sure which son they are choosing, whether Isaac knows it's Jacob who's playing Esau, and whether David understands that he chose Solomon, as Nathan and Bathsheba tell him. Did he? We don't really know. Edom is an adversary, both in our story in Genesis, where we're told several times Esau is Edom, and we were told in the oracle, and Rebekah was told, 2 nations are in your womb, and some scholars read this story without paying attention to that, as we'll see. So Edom is an adversary, and we see that in 1 Kings, where Edom is named as an adversary to Solomon, just as Esau is to Jacob. And Esau hunted game to try to establish his right to the blessing, while Adonijah sacrifices oxen, cattle, and sheep as an expression of his claim. So a number of other ways intertextually that we can see the connections between this story and the monarchy story. And so I want to look at some of the questionable assumptions that are made by a number of scholars. And it's an interesting thing how scholars who were trained in scholarship, of course, in finding evidence, and their scholarly articles are peer-reviewed, and yet a number of these assumptions are left unquestioned. And honestly, it's the lawyer in me who's asking, where's the evidence? So even though I left being a lawyer almost 4 decades ago, the training is still in me, and that's what I'm bringing to this little exercise here. And another one we'll see as a close-up around number 4. So one of the first ones is the oracle in Genesis 25 conveys Yahweh's will that Jacob, that is to say Israel, would rule over Esau, which is to say Edom. But it doesn't say that. The oracle simply says 2 nations are in your womb, and the younger will rule over the older. But does it say that it's Yahweh wants, or is it just saying that's what's going to happen? And in fact, it's not what happens. As we'll see, Israel, at least Jacob, doesn't rule over Esau. Whether Israel rules over Edom is a question outside the conversation in Genesis, and we'll look at that later, but not in this story. We'll look at that in chapter 36, where the narrator keeps telling us Esau is Edom. So there's nothing in the oracle that tells us it's God's will, but many scholars act on the assumption that Rebekah believes it's God's will, and that perhaps she's acting to make the oracle happen, as if you need to do things to make things happen that God says will happen. It didn't say it'll only happen if you do this. There's a whole lot of questions about correlation and causation between the oracle and what happens in our story. Another questionable assumption, the twins' physical features, Esau as hairy and Jacob as smooth, reflect something of their interior lives' spirituality. And certainly we know Jacob will say in our story, I am a smooth man, referring to his smooth skin, but it also is a wordplay, as we saw back in chapter 25, about what kind of character he is. But is it true about Esau? Does the fact that he has a hairy body tell us something about his personality? Are all hairy men hunters? Are all hairy men concerned with food over the future? Obviously not. So that's a certain stereotype that scholars are making, but did the authors of our story imply that stereotype? We're going to have to look and see. Another one, and this is central to both the birthright and the blessing story, this is supposed rights of the firstborn, the Bakora and the Berakah, are divinely sanctioned. to say these are things that God has established, as opposed to what I'm going to suggest, these are cultural norms that the text is implicitly arguing against by showing how absurd it is that the firstborn among twins has the rights that the secondborn, moments later holding his heel, doesn't have. And so we're going to question that. But many scholars just assume that birthright and blessing are somehow something that needs to be defended and protected, as opposed to the text challenge them. That Isaac is weak as a father and is being manipulated by Rebekah and Jacob. And this is almost canonical. Let me show you just a few examples, and I won't name the scholars because I don't want to embarrass people, although their words are printed, and I assume they're not embarrassed by their own words. But notice how we see this. Here's one. Key characteristics and episodes that sketch Isaac as a dull, weak, or a comical figure. From another, Isaac is the weak son of a powerful father and the weak father of two powerful sons. His passivity is in striking comparison to his aggressive wife. Another, Isaac is portrayed as weak and ineffectual. But is that so? So let the lawyer and me bring to the bar before you as the court this challenge of the evidence. So here's the supposed evidence for his weakness. He goes along with his father's attempt to kill him in chapter 22. I didn't put that chapter 22 on here, but you know where that is. And as I suggest, what is a teenage boy supposed to do when his father tells him to come along on a journey? What choices did he have? Where could he have gone? Could he have run away? What would that have meant, to run away in the middle of nowhere? So does that make him weak, or does that make him a good son? In chapter 24, some scholars castigate Isaac because he sits around while Abraham, his father, sends his servant back to the old country to get a wife, and he simply receives her. But again, it's a long, strange trip. Thank you, Grateful Dead, for that one. From Canaan to the old country, and full of dangers. And Isaac's obviously never been there. Abraham has been there. He grew up there, and he knows how difficult it is. But he was brought to Haran by his father. So he didn't go all alone, and he certainly isn't expecting to go back. So he sends his servant, not because Isaac is supposedly weak, but because the old country and its customs are unknown to him, and he realized that his son should get trapped there. Again, not because he's weak, but because he's young and inexperienced. Another example, supposedly, in chapter 26, he, quote, stupidly caught fondling Rebekah in public. But as I noted in the video on that, it will not be in public. It might be that Abimelech was looking through their window rather than through his window, as if Rebekah and Isaac were sitting in the streets having sex, which is certainly unlikely at any time, that they're in their room and he's spying on them. And so it's maybe Abimelech who's being a peeping Tom rather than Isaac, who's somehow doing something stupid. In the beginning of our story, as we hear, he's old and his eyes were dim so he could not see, as you see on the left side of the screen. But being old doesn't mean you're stupid. It doesn't say he has dementia. You think of the classic Greek hero Tiresias from Homer's Odyssey, and used throughout the centuries as the paradigm of a blind seer, that wisdom can come from being blind. And so certainly there's nothing in any tradition, biblical or otherwise, that says blindness is associated with stupidity. And although he's old, many people are old. Abraham was old, and he was really old, but he had more children after Sarah died. So neither age or blindness makes somebody weak or stupid. And in our story, he's focused on food, and that somehow, in some scholars' mind, makes him seem less intellectual or less sophisticated because he's focused on his belly. And maybe that's so, but maybe it's an expression of the love for the son that he has, that Esau's skill is hunting, and Esau hunts good food, and what parent isn't proud of participating in whatever their child can do, whether that's going to their baseball games or their dance parties or eating the cupcakes they make or whatever it might be, not because your focus is on food, because your focus is on the child you love. So every one of these expressions for his weakness can easily be questioned. But here's some evidence for his strength of character that we've seen. For example, he joins with Ishmael, sorry for a typo there, to bury their father. So he reaches out and finds his half-brother, and they work together to bury their father. He successfully prays to Yahweh to overcome Rebekah's barrenness, and it happens immediately, unlike what happens with Abraham and Sarah, and unlike what will happen with Jacob and Rachel. He successfully prays immediately. He's the only one of the patriarchs to sow seed, and it reaps 100-fold harvest. And he becomes so powerful, the local king Abimelech is afraid of him and tells him to leave. How is that the expression of a weak man? After that, he successfully negotiates a dispute over wells with the king and the king's military advisor. So he's not afraid of them, and he doesn't run away, and he stands his ground and works out a dispute. When Yahweh appears to him and blesses him, he builds an altar, just as Abraham did. And finally, he successfully negotiates a border covenant with the Philistines when they come after him at Beersheba. And again, he doesn't back down, he doesn't lie, he doesn't run away, but he stands there and works it out. Unlike Abraham, who lied when Pharaoh challenged him, but perhaps like Jacob will do in working out a similar border dispute with Laban a generation later. So I'd like to suggest that just looking through that one questionable assumption, that you can decide for yourself. Do you think Isaac is weak, or do you think Isaac is strong, or do you think he's just ordinary, showing perhaps some signs of weakness and some signs of strength, but that starting off with the assumption that Isaac is weak is not fair. So let's continue through our assumptions here. That a human father can convey the Abrahamic blessing. In other words, what Isaac is doing is conveying the blessing to his son that was conveyed to Abraham. And later it becomes clear that that's not so. The text makes it clear that it's not so, and a number of scholars agree that it's not so, that only God can do that. But some scholars slip and suggest that that's what Isaac is doing here. And similarly, some say that Isaac's blessing of Jacob, quote unquote, fulfills the oracle. And I think that's wrong at two levels. One is fulfilling the oracle means the oracle would come true, which is to say that the elder would serve the younger. Well, that certainly doesn't happen in our immediate scene, and it doesn't happen later. All it does is reinforce the oracle by saying it's Isaac's will that the oracle happen the way the oracle said. But it doesn't actually do anything. It's just one human person's words. And that goes to this one. So let me jump to number 7. People assume that the words Isaac conveys to his son as blessing have actual power. In other words, they're actually conveying something meaningful. But they're plainly not. Any more than if I send my son up to college and say, I hope you get good grades and I hope you meet a good partner and that you get a good job. Well, that's my hope. And what parent wouldn't send their child off with hope? But that doesn't mean it's going to happen. And in fact, it doesn't happen the way that Isaac says. Going back up to number 6, that we are expected to see Jacob's deception as his father is morally bad and a mark on his and Rebekah's character. And many scholars just totally assume that the deception is bad, Jacob is bad, and Rebekah is bad. But the narrator never says so, and the Bible plainly does not agree. Just absolutely plainly does not agree. And the most obvious example is the midwives in Exodus 1. Who lie to Pharaoh when they ask, why is it that you didn't attend to the Hebrew women? And they lie and say the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They give birth like animals. And God rewards the midwives by giving them homes and children. So God plainly and explicitly in Exodus rewards the midwives for being deceptive. And as we could name from the situations with the Jews and the Nazis, or many, many other examples, if the Nazis were at your door, is it not the ethical thing to do to lie to them and not tell them that you have Jews in the basement? So plainly, playing with the truth is not necessarily evil, and there are many ethical situations in their ethical code at the time, and we'll look at the times in a moment, or ours now, where lying and deception is the ethical way to challenge people who have other threats, like violence, or as we'll see, the power of constructed patriarchy here. And as we'll see later, both in this story and later in the Jacob cycle with Rachel, perhaps we're looking at exactly what the authors are trying to convey, is that in the face of power like Laban's power, cultural patriarchy that's reinforced locally and quote-unquote nationally, it's the way of women that is the alternative, the way of cleverness and deception rather than mano a mano as man against man in a physical fight. But we'll look at that more later. And so let's complete these, then we'll look at the reading times. That the parents sending Jacob back to the old country is an emergency expedient because of Esau's anger. In other words, they weren't thinking of it ahead of time, but now that Esau is angry that he didn't get the blessing, that we have to do something to protect Jacob. Rather than that was the plan all along. And I can't do it now, but throughout the story I'm going to suggest it was the plan all along. That was Rebekah's goal all along, was to get Jacob to go back to the old country, and the way to do it was to make Esau so angry with him that Jacob couldn't be comfortable at home. But to show that, we'll have to go through the whole story through a series of videos. That Laban's later deception of Jacob, which is to say he thought he'd have Rachel for a wife and he ends up with Leah as a wife, is divine quote-unquote karma for Jacob's deception of his father, which is to say that God is getting back at him for doing the evil thing of being deceptive. And I'm going to suggest the exact opposite, that Laban's deception is predictable, that Rebekah predicted it and was trying to train her son in the art of deception so he could prepare to face her brother Laban, who she knew well. After all, she grew up with him, and yet it wasn't enough that Laban did trick him. And then finally, as readers, it's imperative to render a moral judgment on the character of each of the people in the story. Thus, Isaac is weak, and Rebekah and Jacob are deceivers, and Esau is more of an animal than a human, etc. But why? Why do we have to render a moral judgment? The narrative doesn't. Maybe that's not the point at all. Maybe it's just to engage the story around some of these times of writing, as I was suggesting. So we've looked at this before, but to situate it in this immediate context. So here's the story time. This is the world taking place in the story. But I'd like to suggest this is the writing time, and we have to take account of in Babylonian exile or in Jerusalem after the exile, when precisely the question at issue is, which women should we marry? And so prefacing and framing the story around Esau marrying the quote-unquote wrong women, precisely the women that the Ezra-Nehemiah people say you shouldn't marry, as we'll see when we begin to enter the passage in the next video, is the point. That over against both the arbitrariness of primogeniture and the arbitrariness of the birthright is the arbitrariness of who you can marry within or without a given community here. And the characters are going along with this not because of exile, but for reasons we don't know. We have no reason to know why the Hittite women make life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah, or why she says at the end, if Isaac is to marry one of the Canaanite women, why should I live? Let him go back and marry a family member. The story does not say anything about it. We have to presume that the audience is in this situation and knows something about it. The Hebrew midrash that comes out is written from this time, and that's dealing with a very different world. I'm not going to use it so much now, because in that context, Edom is Rome, and it's responding to the common era situation where the Romans are now Christians, and the Jews, as Jacob, are responding to Esau as the Christian Romans, who are the older brother, if you will. So that's a very different context than what we're looking at here. So finally, I want to look at just a few scholarly thoughts as we begin our story. And I won't read through all these. I'll post it at radicalbible.net. But just a couple of things from a range of scholars to highlight the questions that we look at as we begin the story. So as OK notes a recent article, the four characters are presented in dialogue form throughout, and that's what we saw in the chiastic structure of the dialogue form. There's some questions, as Sternberg notes, about the transition from Abraham to Isaac versus the transition from Isaac to the next generation. There are questions from an older scholar like Westermann about Rebekah's motivations here, and yet I think what he suggests is really right on. In the case of twins, the exclusive right of the firstborn is acutely incomprehensible. The mother objects to this exclusive prerogative of the one son. And similarly, the Brueggemann and others challenged primogeniture, and that was one of my points in the beginning of this video, that I think that's one of the key themes here. So that sets us up for our story. So as we look at this, looking at the keywords and the structure, we'll go through this as we've been doing one verse at a time. I hope you'll keep all those assumptions in mind and see, as we question them, whether we can reach into the story and find some meaning deeper than many of the scholars do on the surface. See you as we begin that journey next time. Bye-bye.